So if everybody could mute when not speaking and be respectful to others that are talking and just respectful in general.
And you're live, so you can start whenever.
All right. It is now 10 a.m. on the dot. My name is Paris Pittman. I work at Google. I'm also a lead of the special interest group for contributor experience. Welcome to today's edition of the Kubernetes community meeting. First up today, we have Dinesh with Portworx for a demo, and then we're going to go through our usual SIG updates. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. Before SIG updates, we'll have our graph of the week that we get from our DevStats dashboards. And then at the end, we'll round it off with some announcements. All right. So Dinesh, want to go ahead and take it away and share your screen?
Sure. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay. Can everyone see my screen?
You're good to go on my end.
All right, cool. Hi, everyone. My name is Dinesh Israni, and today I'm going to be talking about an open source project called Stork. So the goal with Stork is basically to provide additional intelligence for storage drivers in Kubernetes. So Kubernetes does have good support for storage plugins through in-tree storage drivers as well as flex volume drivers. But the thing is that it does not know about advanced features of storage, such as where data is located or if the storage is healthy on particular nodes or not. So Stork basically aims to solve those issues. So some of the features that we have in 1.0 are basically hyperconvergence. So basically the scheduler actually talks to Stork to figure out where data is located and prioritizes those nodes. It also monitors the storage, the health of the storage drivers on different nodes, and then fails over pods in case storage goes unhealthy on those nodes. And we've also pulled in the snapshot controller and provisioner, that work that's being done in the Kubernetes incubator project, and made it a part of Stork so that you can actually use that if you just deploy Stork. So I'm just going to go ahead and show you a demo of how this works. So the way Stork has been implemented, it basically has a plugin interface, so you can actually write drivers for any of your storage solutions. So right now, the drivers that have been implemented is just Portworx. I'm just going to show you the interface that needs to be implemented for other drivers. So it's a very simple interface. You just need to implement these 6 APIs, and then you would be able to basically integrate it with Stork. So since Portworx is the only volume that's supported right now, I'm just going to show you a quick demo of how this would work if you're launching pods, if things are failing over, and how you can basically take snapshots. So let me show you how you can deploy Stork first. So Stork is basically for the hyperconvergence feature, we basically implemented Stork as a scheduler extender. So what we do is basically you can either configure your default scheduler to talk to Stork, or you can launch an additional instance of a scheduler, give it a different name, and then make it talk to Stork. Since I didn't want to muck around with my default scheduler, I have basically just created an additional scheduler, and I have basically called it Stork. And this is just using the default kube scheduler image. And what I've done is I've basically said that I want to use the Stork config. And this is basically defined here. So in the Stork config, I'm basically saying that one of the extenders that I want to use is Stork. I've basically defined a service for it, and I've said that every time you want to schedule something, please send it the filter and the prioritize requests. And this is basically how Stork is started up. This is the deployment for Stork. So basically, you can specify the driver that you want to use for Stork, and then that's about it. So I've already started Stork. I've already created these 2 deployments. So I'm just going to show you. So both Stork and the scheduler are running in HA mode. So one of them becomes the leader. And I'm just going to tail the stock logs to show you how we would basically do the hyperconvergence when pods are started up. So I'm just going to use a MySQL deployment. What I'm going to do is I have actually defined two PVCs over here. Both of them are using the Portworx volume storage class. One of them is going to be used for the data, and I've just created another PVC just for to be mounted in a temporary location. I'm going to talk about why I've actually used two volumes. So basically, one of them gets mounted into the MySQL path, and one of them is just a temp path. So what happens is basically every time. So let me just go ahead and start this off. So kubectl create -f. So what's going to happen here is once the pod gets once we create this deployment and the PVCs get created, when the scheduler tries to schedule the pod, it's going to basically talk to Stork. And what Stork is going to do is it's going to look at the two PVCs that are part of that are being used by the deployment, and then talk to the driver that is configured with. In this case, it's Portworx. So it's basically going to talk to Portworx and figure out where the data for those two volumes lie. And it's basically going to prefer the node which has data local for both of those pods, for both of those PVCs. So now that I've created this, when we go here, we'll see that initially it will be erroring out, but once the PVCs have been created, we'll see that this will actually get a filter request and then a prioritized request. So the filter request is basically just going to filter out nodes where Portworx or the driver that has been configured is not running. And then basically the prioritized request is going to prioritize the nodes where data is running. So let's see what happened. So we actually got a filter request from the scheduler. The request basically consisted of the three nodes that are in the Kubernetes cluster. It basically sent in KB2, KB4, and KB3, and we basically responded saying that it is all right to schedule the pod on all the three nodes. So this was the filter response. Now, once the scheduler got that, it basically sent another prioritized request saying that these are the three nodes, and I want you to basically prioritize these nodes. And what we did was we then contacted the driver and figured out where the volumes were lying. And in this case, we figured out that volume 1 was on KB2 and KB3, and the other was on KB2 and KB3 too. And this is the response that we ended up sending over here. So for every right now, Stork, for every node that has a volume, it increments the score by 100. And if there's no no volume on that node, it basically gives it a default score of 10. So in this case, since both KB2 and KB3 had both the volumes, it ended up giving both of them a score of 200. And now if we look at, so basically what should have happened is it should have started up on either KB2 or KB3. And we can confirm that by just looking at the pods, and you see that it did in fact get started on KB2. So this can be used by other drivers for various other reasons. For example, if it's just iSCSI LUNs, you could basically try to figure out which of these nodes have more. If you want to basically load balance your targets, you could basically figure that out and then prioritize your nodes based on that. So the second feature in Stork is basically how am I doing at time? I have 2 minutes. So basically, what happens is if the driver goes unhealthy on one of those nodes, Stork is basically polling the health of the storage drivers. So this is when it's polling it, and it's basically going to figure out that something's gone bad, and then delete pods from those nodes. So since I don't have much time, I'm going to skip that, and I'm going to show you how we can take snapshots. So if you do get PVC, you will see that we actually have these two PVCs, and you can basically take a snapshot of these PVCs. So you can specify the PVC that you want to snap and the name of the snapshot. And if I just basically create the snapshot, and then we'll see that it has actually created a snapshot. And we can actually look at Portworx, and you this is basically a list of all the volumes that Portworx has, and we'll see that it has actually created a snapshot of that PVC too. Now we can basically take this snapshot and create a clone of the snapshot and attach it to another application. So the way to do that is basically in the PVC, you would give it an annotation specifying the snapshot name, and the storage class would basically be Stork, because Stork is the one that knows about these snapshots and how to restore from these snapshots or take clones. So I'm just going to basically create a clone from the snapshot and then attach that to another instance of MySQL. So once I do this, you will see that the snapshot, the clone will actually be created as a PVC itself. So as you see, it actually got, the PVC got created. And if I look at the volume list again from the storage driver, you'll see that it is actually here. And we can actually, if I inspect it, you'll see that the source, the parent, is the previous snapshot. So this basically makes it easy from kubectl itself to take snapshots and do restores. So there's more information on the scheduler extender in the blog that we've put up, and the source code is on GitHub. So right now, like I mentioned, it has support only for the Portworx driver, but we welcome contributions from the community to add support for more drivers. And we plan to add more features. For example, there might be conditions where you might not, you might want to also prioritize based on the zone and other failure domains. So we're going to add support for that. We're also going to add support for different types of backups. Yeah, and I guess that's it. Any questions?
Thanks, Dinesh. No questions? All right. Dinesh, I'm sorry. Did someone say?
Do you have a documentation for this shared when it comes to Red Hat Linux as well? I'm Atul. I work in Symantec. We are just trying to evaluate all of these solutions in our environment. But we standardize everything using Red Hat Enterprise Linux, CentOS 7.4. And most of our environment is hardened, like all packages. Then we have to scan and validate all of this. If you have a documentation when it comes to Red Hat, that will help us a lot.
Do you mean the actual container, the image?
Yeah.
Okay, so the current image is based on Ubuntu, but I think we are actually planning to move to either Red Hat or Atomic images. So.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So if you can send me an email, or just send me an email. I'll point you to that information. Yeah.
Where can I find your email ID? I actually, this is my first meeting. I don't want to boss hog it, but if you guys could share your contacts, that will be helpful.
Sure. I'll just paste it in the chat. You can contact me.
I'll just see. This is Luis.
It's also on the SIG community document. Actually, my email's on there.
Also, I would encourage you to participate in the GitHub lib open source Stork and create an issue for that, and we can then communicate through there too.
Okay.
All right, we have one more question, and that's the last one. Is it dependent on Portworx, or was that just for the demo?
It was just for, so right now Portworx is the only supported driver, but you can, like I pointed out over here. So all you would need to do is basically create a small driver for any storage solution, and you would be able to plug that in.
Great.
So these are the only 6 APIs that you need to implement for any driver to basically be able to use it with Stork.
Cool. All right. Thanks again, Dinesh. Appreciate your time today. If anybody needs Dinesh, he is going to paste his contact in the chat. There's also contact on the agenda and notes today. All right. So quick thank you also to our note taker today, Josh Burkus. We're always looking for note takers for this meeting. Just feel free to jump in when you can. Next up is Jace with the 1.10 release update.
Thank you, Paris. We are at a pivotal moment in the release cycle, which is week 6 of 12. So 50% of the release time has expired. From this point forward, we're going to start moving a little bit faster and a lot more work in terms of release team activities. In the agenda for the community meeting, there's a link to the official schedule. So if you're curious, please review that. It is important. We stick to it. We reference this all the time. So if hopefully there are no surprises as things like code freeze come along, which is happening on February 26th. So feature freeze is passed, but you may be interested in knowing what some of the SIGs are going to be delivering this particular release. There's a link in the agenda as well to the feature tracking spreadsheet in there, and you can see what is happening. There is a feature exception process, so if SIGs have had a delay for some reason and haven't been able to get their feature fully documented, definitely work with the release team. We don't want to hamper people unnecessarily, but we're also trying to avoid the case where things are getting delivered in the last minute and maybe in a way that isn't necessarily as thought out or fully supported as it needs to be at the quality we expect. So next week, we're going to be cutting our first beta release, and we're going to be assembling the release branch. This means that essentially we're going to have to fast forward the daily commits in the master into the release branch, so we keep those synchronized. And having the release branch allows us to pop up all the testing and make sure that all the signal looks good on those changes that go in. So we'll be updating you about the progress on that next week. If you haven't seen it, I do send a weekly email to the Kubernetes dev list that has sort of the status and everything for the release. If that's helpful, definitely let me know. I'm trying to raise visibility of this release generally so that we have better radiation of these deadlines and timeframes so people aren't surprised, because it seems like every release there's a surprising amount of surprise. So let's not do that. Release team meetings are in a weekly cadence. Excuse me. In February 26th, we're going to switch to Monday, Wednesday, Fridays. And 2 weeks before the release cut, we are going to have daily release burndown meetings. Everybody's invited. If you join the Kubernetes Milestone Burndown group, you will get an invite to that automatically, and you can attend, and I try and make them entertaining. No promise of puppies, but there may be a puppy at some point in one of those meetings, just FYI. And remember, again, the code freeze begins on February 26th, and I unearthed the blink HTML tag, which doesn't work. Just so imagine that February 26th blinking in your mind, because it's important. Any questions about the release process or what we're doing or so forth? All right, deafening silence means no. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Jace, as always. Next, we are doing our new Graph of the Week segment with Tim Pepper giving our graph today. I'll also post the DevStats link in the chat so folks have that. And take it away, Tim.
And the links are also in the minutes, so a couple things I'm going to show. This follows on nicely, I think, to what Jace just said about surprising amount of surprise. So as background, the release team has a set of leads and specific roles, and then shadows who are learning about the process and looking to come up and contribute more. So Josh Burkus is the issue triage lead, and I'm the shadow there. And as we went through the feature freeze phase, I started to wonder about kind of the ebb and flow of the cadence and what might be coming, and that kind of how much surprise is coming next. So what I've come to understand is there's a little bit of complexity here. So everybody knows about issues in GitHub, but things are more complicated in Kubernetes because we've got all sorts of labels, and then we have also on GitHub, there's projects and milestones, and some folks use those or not. And then we also have this other repo that's the Kubernetes/features. So that there's a lot of different places, and it got me wondering, well, like, do we have a normal classic S-curve of feature creation and close, or what does this actually look like? So I'm going to share my screen here to show these couple graphs. And within these, then I'm wondering, like, are there trends? Are there things that are observable, and what are we seeing here? So this first one is the 7-day moving average SIG release kind all for issues, and we've got the release markers there. So maybe not a whole lot to see there. Like, there's not completely a clear front loading of features and then closing. There's some other spikes there in the middle. So then that got me off on the second chart. This one is, again, 7-day moving average, all the SIGs, kind feature specifically. And instead of seeing a spike at the beginning of the release and then a tail down, there's actually a number of phases here. And if you correlate these in time to the timelines for 1.8, 1.9, and 1.10, which are roughly what's shown here in the right 3/4 of the screen, these actually, you start to realize that these correspond kind of to the open initial phase, feature freeze, code freeze, and final stabilization. But the numbers are actually increasing as we go through the phase. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. You might be having sort of these overarching features and then sub things being split off the sides of them, but it raises some questions about maybe what's going on there. And one of the reasons I was looking in this direction is we had some concerns that some SIGs are missing. In the 1.10 release, we had a particular SIG that was notably late in a bunch of features. So trying to understand if there are things that we could do here better to help particular SIGs. And I think Aaron Krickenberger's mentioned a number of times that we maybe need a little more dimensionality in these. The third one that I wanted to show then is you are able to toggle across the different SIGs, but again, you kind of have these 4 phases that are visible across the release as opposed to sort of a big upfront. And interestingly, the one SIG we're curious about, now I'm looking specifically at features here, you see maybe a little bit more of what you might expect. Leading up to the release, they're starting to build things into the system maybe, and then resolving them. So the data is not entirely clear, but one of the things I like about this set of charts was that I came away with a few more questions that I started with and some ideas for some additional data that I might like to try to pull out. And I think that's what I would like to see people doing with DevStats, coming with a question, looking for answers, finding more questions, starting additional conversations on how we can improve as we go. So that's what I had for the week.
Cheers. And quick plug for contributor experience if anybody's interested in DevStats and digging down deeper. We'd love to have you. We meet on Wednesdays. All right. Thanks, Tim. All right, next we are going into our SIG updates portion. Up first is SIG architecture with Brian.
Okay. So SIG architecture has been working on a few issues. We continue to work on the KEP, the Kubernetes Enhancement Proposal process, which is intended to be a formalization of the long-standing design and proposal process. It's kind of a cross between a product requirements document and a design document, serving sort of both roles and other roles. So we continue to try to flesh that out. We have a couple of efforts testing out the process. We do want to try to make it lightweight. We're basically trying to provide clarity about what people should do as opposed to just sort of the cargo culting that people have been doing, copying previous proposals or not even being aware that why or how proposals are useful and things like that. So that's been one of the big efforts. Something that we've done more recently is started identifying sub-projects within the overall project and under the umbrella of each individual SIG. So our goal is to make sure that all code in the project is covered by some SIG and is clear which SIG that is and which sub-effort or sub-project within that SIG the code corresponds to, so that people working on the code know what SIGs, understand what SIGs and sub-projects to go to with issues or to discuss changes, and also people who are engaging with SIGs know where all the pieces relevant to the SIG are. So Aaron Krickenberger in particular has done a lot of work on this for all the freestanding repos in Kubernetes and Kubernetes Incubator. And we've done a few of the directories within the Kubernetes repo as well, for example, for the workloads APIs. The next step we need to do is go identify the rest of the sub-projects effectively within the Kubernetes repository. So an example subproject might be kubedns, for instance, which is another one we called out. So I'd actually like to plead to all the SIGs to, this is being recorded right now in sigs.yaml. The intent is to make it bidirectional so that it will actually go in owner's files, pointing back up to the subprojects and SIGs as well. But right now we're just trying to identify all these, where everything lives in sigs.yaml and the community repo. So take a look at what's there already. If there, not everything is identified for your SIG, and that's true, especially for the kind of the big long-standing SIGs like API Machinery, SIG Node, and others. Help us flesh that out. And actually, an upcoming topic is putting creating new repos for new code that we're going to talk about. And before we start creating a lot of new repos for new code for SIGs, we want to identify where the current code lives. So we'll talk more about that in a minute. So that's about it for now. Those are the main efforts.
Questions for Brian?
I can't see the chat if people are putting stuff in the chat.
No, it looks like request, please figure out a way for issues and VRs to be tagged with their related KEP. But no questions. And send feedback to Joe as well. All right, thanks, Brian. All right, next we have SIG scalability. Bob, I saw you on the line earlier.
I'm here. Give me just a moment. Note to self, whenever following Brian in a community meeting, ask for the schedule to be switched around. Okay. Can you see this?
Yep, I am good on my end. If anybody has any issues, let us know.
Oh yeah, let me figure out how to go. Let me see if I can go full screen here. Yeah, well. Okay, so I'll go through this fairly quickly. Just logistics recap. One thing to note is that to avoid a conflict with SIG architecture, we moved our time out by 30 minutes. We've also shifted to a bi-weekly cadence. Links are here. I'll go pretty quickly. I will say we don't do much on the mailing list. Slack and meeting notes are probably the two main areas that interaction occurs. So for those of you who are not familiar with the SIG, it's a small but very consistent group. Same people show up pretty much, very, very regularly. And the shift from how do we build bigger and bigger clusters to how do we ensure that the big clusters that we build are really great is pretty complete at this point. I think most of the real work in the SIG at this point is about fighting regressions, which does continue to beg the question about the beyond 5,000 node question. I'd say there's very little discussion in the SIG about this at this point, but if you have a passion for this, please show up. There's definitely some signal out there that some folks are interested in configs a lot bigger than this. I might point you to the firmament scheduler stuff, which looks kind of interesting, although it's maybe early. Running much bigger clusters seems to be one of the things they're after. So we'd love to have the firmament folks come to SIG Scalability and give us an update at some point. Okay. So we have a new charter. This is really the main thing I wanted to surface to the community. There's the pull request. The SIG is fine with it. I think we're not really quite sure what we need to do to make sure to sort of validate that this is it. But I'm sure we'll work that out over the coming weeks. big shout out to Parj for driving all the doc work around this and getting this done. So thanks very much for that. Thought it might be worth just to pull a couple of the things out from the charter, just in terms of who we are, defining goals, measuring those goals, contributing to system-wide issues is the main story. So this is fundamentally a sort of tooling effort, tooling and consultation, but a lot of the effort is, I'm sure you're unsurprised, is tooling oriented. And really, I think the key thing here is our goal is not to be firefighters, but to try to keep the fires from breaking out. So this is the focus on aggression. And I think that's really probably going to be our theme for this year, is working on tooling. I just picked like one of the recent things that's sort of along these lines from the PR flow, but there's going to be more coming up in future SIG meetings in this area. So sort of a final thought question on all this. Kind of an interesting thing that the last KubeCon, we have another KubeCon coming up. Last KubeCon, one of the things that we plan to do is have a SIG get together, and we've kind of thought it would be more developer types getting together and having deeper conversations about this. And one of the things that happened was we had a lot of users show up and ask a lot of questions about how big can you make things and what does that mean, and lots of interest from users in running big clusters. So a question is whether we're doing a good enough job out at SIG scalability and really kind of explaining what Kubernetes scalability is and means. So would love to have some feedback to that. A shout out to Sham. He was one of the Google folks. He showed up and did just an awesome job walking the community folks through kind of how we do testing, and that really helped people out. So thanks for that. I hope he makes it to Copenhagen. And that's it. You almost always get my face for the updates as opposed to Wojtek, just because he's in Poland and the time doesn't really work for him very well. So there you go. Let me now check. I need to stop sharing on this and I think check the. All right. Any questions?
Can we get a link to the slides?
Yes, I will post a link to the slides here in a moment. The link to the slides is also in the SIG Scalability channel, because I like to make sure the slides get out before the meeting, and also in the SIG Scalability agenda meeting notes log as well, but I'll post one here in a minute.
And I think there is a question.
What is the question?
Any questions? I thought there was. All right. All right. Well, thanks, Bob. Appreciate it. Next up, we have SIG scheduling. Bobby?
I'm Bobby from SIG scheduling. In SIG scheduling, one of the big items that we have for 110 is moving priority and preemption to beta. Priority and preemption is a new feature in Kubernetes, currently in alpha in 1.9, that we would like to move it to beta. It's actually a pretty useful feature if you run multiple workloads in a cluster, or if you would like to improve your cluster resource utilization. For example, if you're running production workload and you're running some of the other not so important or not so latency critical workloads in the same cluster, it'll be a great help, because now you can specify the importance of your various workloads with priority. And if your cluster is under resource pressure, preemption ensures that your important workloads always get the resources in your cluster, and your non-important workloads, for example, your CI/CD pipeline or whatever else you are running as low priority workload, will be moved out automatically. It's very, very useful for people who run their clusters on-prem, because in on-prem clusters, you normally don't have the same flexibility of adding and removing nodes easily as you do have in cloud providers. So if you're interested in trying this feature, we are looking for people who are willing to try this with real workloads. So we really would like to get your feedback. It's vital for us to get some real feedback from real users before we can move it to beta in 1.10. Please contact me in that case, or just send an email to CQ Scheduling. My email address is bsalamat, the same for my Slack handle. Another item that we're working on in CQ Scheduling is performance improvement. As we're adding more and more features to Scheduler, we realize that performance is going down, and it's pretty natural because we're adding more complex features, and all of them require more processing, of course. So we have like a couple improvements, performance improvement projects. One is to enable equivalence cache, as we call it. Equivalence cache, basically the idea behind it is that we store information about the scheduling decisions for a pod. And if another pod has the same scheduling requirements, we use the same scheduling decision for the second pod and other future pods. If things in the cluster, or particularly in that node that we've made the scheduling decision, hasn't changed. If things change, then we invalidate the cache and reevaluate the scheduling decision. Another item that we try to basically work on and optimize performance is find ways to improve performance of affinity and anti-affinity. These are some predicates currently in alpha that take a lot of computation resources. We've seen that they are at least a couple orders of magnitude slower than other predicates that we have. We definitely need to optimize these, or maybe limit their flexibility a bit before we can move them to beta. So this is also something that we're working on. There is also a big plan for scheduling. We've noticed that the current extension mechanism of the scheduler is not necessarily great for all use cases, particularly if you're interested in adding extensions that require fast communication with the scheduler. Current extension mechanism is not a great way of adding plugins, because we currently have this like interface over HTTP, and we do lots of marshalling on marshalling. So we are thinking about making the scheduler more like a framework plus an SDK that allows you to have like in-process plugins as well as external plugins. So this is another item that we're working on. And finally, very quickly, I would like to point out 3 incubators that we currently have. Cube Arbitrator is an effort to add certain new features to scheduling. That one is to do gang scheduling. Second one is to support CODA for hierarchical namespaces. These are things that Cube Arbitrator does. We have another incubator, cluster capacity tool. This is a tool that allows you to dry run certain things in your cluster. Basically, you point it to a running cluster, and it restores the state of that cluster. Then you can create a pod in a tool, and that tool tells you whether the pod can be scheduled, or if it cannot, it tells you how much more resources you need. Finally, we have the scheduler. The scheduler job is to evaluate your cluster and determine if there can be a smarter or more efficient way of scheduling your pods. In that case, it removes some of your pods or deschedules some of your pods and allows the scheduler to evaluate those and place them more efficiently in the existing nodes in your cluster. That's all for CQ scheduling. If there's any question, I would have a answer.
Bobby, could you explain what the arbitrator does one more time?
Sure. The arbitrator basically does 2 things currently. One is that it does gang scheduling. Gang scheduling is basically, the idea behind gang scheduling is that you have a number of pods that you would like to schedule them all together, or none. If you cannot schedule them all, you don't want to schedule them at all. So arbitrator supports that.
So it's time deferred scheduling. They may not all schedule right away.
You're right.
At all, they may not schedule right now if not all of them schedule.
Exactly. And the second feature that it's going to support is supporting quota for hierarchical namespaces. So if you have like namespaces which are hierarchical, then you can specify, for example, quota for the higher level namespace, and the namespaces below that one will share that quota.
One more question. One of the main problems with resource scheduling is race conditions. Is there a general discussion somewhere of how we're handling the various race conditions inherent in scheduling things against available resources?
I don't know if we have any particular central place where we're discussing these, but we would like to hear your feedback about like the race conditions that you face, and we'll try to address some of them. Currently, actually, a scheduler does like serial scheduling mainly to avoid some of these scenarios, but I would like to know what exactly the problem, what are the exact problems that you run into, and I would like to address.
Josh, any follow-ups to that?
No, I'll follow up on SIG scheduling.
Okay. All right. That wraps up the SIG updates for this week. Now we have announcements, and our first update is from the steering committee.
Sure. So one of the main efforts that the steering committee has been involved in has been figuring out how we want to structure our repositories going forward, and how we want to work with the incubator and incubation process that we had previously. There is a PR that has been posted to the Kubernetes community repo and is in the community meeting notes that summarizes our proposal. And basically, the summary of the proposal is to say, well, we are going to sunset or close down Kubernetes incubator. That doesn't mean we're going to, kick out existing projects, but we're not going to accept any new projects in Kubernetes incubator. And instead, we are identifying 3 classes of repositories. The first class of repository is what we've called associated repositories, which are basically repositories that are largely independent from Kubernetes, but sort of are conformant with the community guidelines, including the CNCF CLA and the Code of Conduct. And those are pretty freeform beyond that. A step closer to the main project is the notion of a SIG-sponsored or SIG-associated repository, and that's a repository where a Kubernetes SIG agrees that they are working on it. It is intended to be a place where SIG members are actively working on the project, not just a SIG that has sort of adopted someone else's project, but one where the SIG members are actually actively working on it. The restrictions on those projects are a little bit tighter and are detailed in the pull request. And then finally, Kubernetes repos or Kubernetes core repositories are sort of the closest thing into the repository, and they are expected to be things that are really core to the operation of the cluster. And therefore, instead of being approved by a SIG specifically, are going to be approved by a SIG architecture in general. I definitely encourage everybody to take a look at that. There's also a fact at the end of the pull request that tries to answer some questions that people would have. There's also been some comments, and I'm going to go through, and others maybe have gone through and responded to some of the comments. But please go through and take a look, because this is how we propose to move forward with repositories here on out. I want to emphasize that this is intended to be about new repositories going forward. This is not intended to churn any existing repositories. We don't want to disrupt anyone's current workflow. Eventually, we will address that, but really the goal here is to unblock people who wanted new repositories, people who are wondering about graduation from incubator. Those are the concrete goals behind the work. I don't know if anybody else from the steering committee wants to add anything else.
Are we unmuted? Yeah. So I just want to reemphasize a point I quickly made earlier, and I just made a comment on the doc about this. We're not going to force any changes to existing repositories or code other than, for example, you need following some of the rules which are in here, like you must have an owner's file. You need to point to that owner's file from sigs.yaml and things like that, so we can start really understanding what SIG owns, which piece of code, where all their code lives, and so on. So before you request a new repository, we're going to ask SIGs to go do that homework.
Oh, right, and explicitly also, yeah, track the code that the code directories that they own, right?
Yeah, so for SIGs who do want to move some code out of Incubator to, for example, SIG repos, that should be possible and straightforward. I need to check with Aaron about whether there's anything else we have to actually do to that GitHub organization to make it open for business, but we're working on that.
So I got a quick question here, if it's okay to ask questions now. The associated repos, which are, I guess, any repo, it's not part of any Kubernetes org necessarily, but it has, you're basically signing up to use the CLA and institute the CLA bot and rules and apply the code of conduct. Who would want to use and do an associated repo versus just something off on their own? Like, what's the benefit? Why do it? And how does it help unblock this incubation process?
So there's two motivations there. One motivation is that people believe, for whatever reason, that it is code that may eventually wind up inside of Kubernetes. And bringing code in that hasn't been covered by the CLA throughout its lifetime is significantly more tricky because you have to go back and get the copyright assurances from all of the various contributors. And then the other piece of it is that we believe that if 2 or 3 members of the community want to come together and collaborate on something, it makes sense for them to establish a consistent process with the code of conduct, as well as with, in some cases, companies that have to approve their participation in an open source project. And so having one CLA that someone can go get filled out once that then covers open source contributions to a variety of different community projects, in many cases at some more traditional companies, is easier. And so those are the two motivations, basically just to reduce the barriers to people collaborating together inside of the Kubernetes community.
So it would be kind of the case where, when would be a case where you'd want to do a collaboration as an associated project and it wouldn't be a SIG sponsored project?
Where it's just sort of 2 or 3 people working on something. I think that where it's not necessarily clear, maybe it's a tool, for example. Maybe you have a great idea. Like, as an example, I have started working on this tool I'm calling Kube Sanity, which is basically the ability to run sanity checks on a cluster for various properties that you expect to always be true and fire up alerts if they're not. I don't think a SIG is ever going to really own that. I don't ever really expect there to be more than 2 or 3 contributors. I think that's a great example of where you might want that to be an associated repository. I think there's also a degree to which maybe you just want more freedom, right? Maybe you don't want to, have a SIG be able to tell you how it should be, how that code should be written, and that's another motivation.
So why would that be an associated project and not just something else in the ecosystem like so many of the other tools that are already out there?
It certainly could be. There's no reason for it not to be, right? I think that the motivation for allowing it or identifying it as a example is to make it easier for people in the community to contribute, because they know that the code of conduct will be applied, because they've already made arrangements with their company to sign the CLA. But there's no reason. I mean, if somebody doesn't want to, none of this is intended to block people from having free-range wild repositories out wherever they feel like having them. This is actually just sort of to give people who want to take a step into the community a first step in that doesn't require a lot of approvals, that is opt-in as opposed to having to convince a group to approve it.
Yeah, last time I checked, there were something like 10,000 GitHub repos that mention Kubernetes. I wouldn't expect or want all of those to become associated repos. You know, it really is about scenarios where people working on those projects think it would unblock other contributors from contributing to fall under kind of the same sorts of rules as actual Kubernetes project efforts.
Yeah, and so part of the reason that I asked this is I'm probably going to go put a comment on there asking for some of this to be added to it, just for somebody who comes along and says, why would I use this, to have clarity of that. And so I'll probably go put a comment on there because it wasn't exactly clear how this should be used or when it should be used or what it was for. And so if somebody comes along like me who's not entirely clear, spelling this out in a few bullets might help.
Sure, I'll add a fact question for that. That makes sense.
Thank you.
For sure. And probably also another fact, like around the fact that this is definitely opt-in, right? This isn't required for anyone who wants to build something. You know, we're not going to like block demos at community meeting on associated repositories or anything like that. This is just trying to give people structure for those who want it.
All right. Now, just to be cognizant of time, if you have any more questions, comment on the GitHub issue. Again, the issue is in the Zoom chat as well as the agenda for today. Thanks so much for that update. All right, our next announcement, Intel. Jose, are you on? Saw you earlier. Jose, last call. All right, we'll go to the next one. George, are you on for shout-outs?
Yes, I am.
Sorry,
Oh, go ahead, Jose.
Hey, sorry, I was having trouble with two mutes. George put me on the schedule. I just wanted to say hello. I'm going to be the program manager for Intel's Kubernetes efforts kind of going forward. So we've added a team of about 16. So if you have questions or interest in collaborating with us, please feel free to reach out. I'll try and make sure that my contact details and stuff are broadcast out. I'll personally be participating in contributor experience and in SIGPM, and then we'll have probably some of our team members fanning out into, I think right now we're targeting about 10 different SIGs, so you'll see a lot of Intel folks coming online in the next 2-3 weeks. So this is just a heads up and a hello, and look forward to working with everybody.
Awesome, happy to have you. George, can you jump in?
All right, everyone, we have hash shoutouts in Slack, so if you see someone in the community doing something great, just mention them in that channel and we'll give them a shout out every week. This week's shoutouts go to Duffy Cooley, Stefan Szymanski, Craig Tracy, Timothy St. Clair, Chuck Ha, Liz Frost, Nikita Raghunath, Aaron Krickenberger, Ilya Dmitrichenko, Ihor Dvoretsky, Ellen Corbis, and Tim Pepper. Thank you.
Awesome. Yes, if anybody has any shout outs to add, again, that's the Slack channel. Let's give folks the thanks that they need. All right. George, did you want to do the next one as well?
I can, yes. So we moved to, instead of opportunistic scheduling for the SIGs, we basically assigned you a time slot over the next cycle, and that's going to be linked at the document every week. So we've scheduled you out. If you have a scheduling conflict, you're encouraged to swap with other SIG leaders, and what we're going to do is try to keep the same pace so that each SIG can do at least, it averages out to like 1.5 updates per cycle. So find that at the top of the docs.
Awesome. Yes. Yes, SIG. So we are not chasing folks down anymore. All right. And then our last update is Meet Our Contributors. Our first live streamed edition of that went off yesterday morning. It was awesome. We had, I think it was 5 contributors on the line, all taking questions from the Slack channel, Meet Our Contributors, as well as Twitter. This is intended to be a part of the mentoring initiative as an idea for mentoring on demand. ask a contributor anything. We also want to expand this and do peer code reviews. So if you have code that you would like to have a second glance on, also submit that to the Meet Our Contributors on Slack. The GitHub page, as well as the call for volunteers, is in the agenda as well. And that's it for the announcements. Any last minute questions, concerns, comments for any of the announcements or SIG updates? All right. Take quiet as consensus. All right. Thanks so much. You have 5 minutes left to get to your next meeting. All right. Bye, everybody. Have a good day.